Pandemic Iberia, a game in the Pandemic family that came out, I believe, last year, but I hadn't acquired the copy yet. I mean, I like Pandemic. You can see some versions of Pandemic there in the background. I really enjoyed the game. I also play it fairly often with my 6-year-old daughter Amelia, who loves it and who is fairly proficient at it. And precisely because of this, I had mixed feelings. Well, I like Pandemic, but I have Pandemic. Do I really need to add yet another implementation of the Pandemic system? So I wanted to get it, but I felt a little bit guilty with that. Do I really need it? Then, of course, the afterthought is like, do you really need any games? Well, yes, of course I do, because that's my hobby and I love them. And recently was Father's Day, so I thought, well, I think I'll give myself a present. So I gave myself a copy of Pandemic. And this is why it's great to have these special occasions, because we feel less guilty to buy stuff that we are afraid may not be all that useful. So Pandemic Iberia, new iteration of the system with different rules, a different board, and one that I played solo, and I played it with my daughter. And so now I want to tell a little bit about the game in general, about the production values, about gameplay, and at the end we will address the question, do you need the Pandemic Iberia if you already have other versions of Pandemic? Is it hard enough to warrant the investment in the game? Well, let me show you how the game works and how the game looks, and then we'll try to address that question. The board of the game is a real beauty, I have to say, definitely much more attractive because of its general look and the color palette than the original Pandemic game. Also very thematic, very appropriate to the theme. Talking about the board from the point of view of gameplay, you will also notice that the organization of the net of connections is very different. You do not have those clusters of nets like you have in regular Pandemic or even in Cthulhu Pandemic. It's much more organic, much more of, well, it's almost like a square situation, almost like a square configuration, so it's much easier to go from anywhere to anywhere. Generally speaking, meaning that you do not have bottlenecks. The map feels much more organic. You'll be able to travel from LAN connection to LAN connection, simply following the lines here. Also, you have port cities, as identified by small anchor icons, and you'll be able, in a poor man's version of air transportation from the original Pandemic, to move from port city to port city by discarding cards. So moving along the coast allows you for faster travel, but again with a restriction, because then you have to also move from location to location in the land. And there is a very interesting addition to the system here that will allow you to move by land faster than otherwise. Gameplay in general is very similar to traditional Pandemic. You have a hand of cards representing locations, and you may discard them to perform special actions. You need to collect 5 cards of a certain type to research a disease. And once you researched all 4 diseases by discarding 5 cards of a color in a specific location, then you win the game, unless one of the possible situations that allow you to lose the game occurs first. And you lose the game if you ever have 8 outbreaks, if you run out of cards from the main deck, or if you should add a new disease cube to the board due to the implementation of the mechanics, and you can't because the pool of that disease is depleted. All the cubes are already on the board. So this is very similar to Pandemic, and again, similar to traditional Pandemic. You take 4 actions in any order, any combination, then you get 2 new cards. Some cards may be epidemic cards that will make things much worse for you. There will be event cards, which are particularly good, shuffled in with the locations, the number of which will depend on the number of players. Then you infect new places by drawing cards from that deck of locations on the board. So you add new diseases to the board, the number of which depends on the rate of infection that will go up during the game. And you continue like this until either you research all 4 diseases and win the game, or again you meet one of the, not victory conditions, one of the defeat conditions, whichever comes first. You win or you lose. Again, very similar, very similar. However, you may already have noticed a couple of differences. Like, for example, I said you research rather than you cure. Yes, the technology, the science is simply not quite there yet. So you make an advancement in a disease, and you move this token from here to here, or I guess from here to here, whichever, as long as you're consistent, to indicate that you researched that disease, which means you're one step closer to victory, but you do not have all the advantages that you get in regular pandemic from curing a disease. You cannot eradicate a disease. My daughter really likes to play the card representation of pandemic that once you cure a disease, you simply vaporize disease cues by moving through a location. You don't have that uber powerful move here. Too bad. And my daughter had, took a minute to adjust to that. Speaking of characters and what they can do, here are the new characters. I'm not gonna read all of their special powers. You can pause the video and read all of the powers for yourself if you want to have that extra level of information. Otherwise, you just look at the images and you get a gist of what the new characters are and can do. Also, if you're reading the text, you will find some new actions described there, such as, again, moving by ship, and we already mentioned that briefly, but you may have seen a card that says Purifying Water. This is a new action, one or two new radically actions that you can perform in the game. Again, some actions will be familiar to you if you played Pandemic in the past. For example, you can move by carriage, which simply move means for an action you move from one location to an interconnected location. You can move by ship, which is you can move between two port cities, from a port city to any other port city, as long as you're discarding a city card that matches the color of your destination. If I discard a yellow card and I'm in a port city, then I can move to any other yellow port city. Very nice, very fast, but limited to some locations, so less flexibility that you have when you're traveling by airplane in Pandemic. And again, expensive because you are sacrificing a card that is a resource. Other super mega cool important action is to build a railroad. The game comes with these railroad tracks, and for an action you can put one down. Suppose that I'm here, one down in a connection that is exiting the location in which I am. So for example, for an action, I'm putting that one down. Then for another action, I'm moving here. Then I spend another action to put that track there. And maybe then another player spends an action in a later turn to put down that connection. While you're creating that infrastructure, very important, because once you have it, then for a single action, you can move along a railroad simply at any distance, as long as you keep moving, through interconnected railroad connections. You have to build connections. You can build connections only on solid lines, not on dotted lines, which makes really sense because a railway here would be weird. So it's great because then you have sort of like long-term planning, as opposed to Pandemic, traditional Pandemic, in which you're always reacting to all the stuff that the design throws at you. Here you're building stuff for long-term. In Pandemic, you have that when you're building research centers, of course, but this just is a new level of long-term planning. Oh yes, you also need to build places where you will research your diseases, and in this game, these are hospitals, which are not wide generic research centers anymore, because they're color-coded. There is a red hospital where you will be able, which is the only place you'll be able to investigate red disease, and you have a black hospital, yellow hospital, and blue hospital. So for an action, you can build a hospital by discarding a card that then matches the city in which you are. If I want to build a hospital in Madrid, I need to discard Madrid. And then to research that disease, you need to go to the hospital, the matching colors. So extra requirement there that makes things tougher. Treating diseases works like in traditional pandemic. A single action removes a disease cube from your current city. Also, speaking of diseases, outbreaks work like in pandemic. If you would need to add a third cube to a place, instead of adding it, you cause an outbreak. Speaking of other actions, another important action, as you can see, the game has certain elements that make it more challenging, like you do not get the benefit from curing diseases, because you can't cure diseases. Specific, unique matching places where you can meet the requirement to research a place as opposed to generic research centers. That's all work. You don't have the ability to teleport from research center to research center, but at least also you have some other actions that will give you some advantages to counterbalance the extra challenges you find here. And the most important new action that gives an advantage is the action of purifying water. When you purify water, you can place these tokens on the board, usually 2 tokens per purify water action that you take. And these tokens are not placed in specific cities, they are placed in regions. And each region is pretty much the area which is surrounded by a net of connections. For example, this is a region that is, again, the borders are the connections. This triangle here would be another region, this other area would be a region, another region, and another region. So basically, when you can place these tokens when you are in a city adjacent to a region. What is good is that they affect the entire region, so they can positively affect all cities that are connected to that region. Usually, you discard a card that matches the color of a city in an adjacent region, and that allows you to purify water in that region. So, for example, if I'm here, I am in this adjacent region, I could discard the yellow card, and then I'm allowed to place those 2 purified waters there. Also, there is an advantage when you have researched a disease. Again, it's not as powerful at curing or eradicating a disease in regular pandemic, but if you discard a card of a disease that has been researched, then you can add 2 purification tokens to a region. So that gives you a little more flexibility. So, for example, and it also allows you to have a use for cards of a disease that you have already researched. For example, if I'm here, let's say I'm here in a location that is surrounded all by black cities. Nevertheless, I research red disease, so I can discard a red card to add 2 purification or purified waters to that region. These tokens are very important because when you would need to add a token to a city that is adjacent to a purified water token, you can discard one of these tokens instead of adding a new disease. So again, it's a nice idea of long-term planning, of like preparing to what the design is going to throw at you, as opposed to just always reacting. And then we have the key action of traditional pandemic, which is still key here, which is the idea of sharing knowledge. When 2 players are in the same city, then a player for an action can take the matching card for that city from the other player, or give that card to another player. I really like the action of the politician that can send cards. As an action, you can give a city card to another player in any city, as long as it matches you are in the city of the card that is passed. So if the politician is in Granada, then the politician can send the Granada card out to other players. Very neat idea. These are the basic concepts of pandemic Iberia. It's very similar to traditional pandemic, but with a different map that presents its own set of challenges, opportunities, and limits, with the new action of building railroads, the possibility, of course, of then exploiting the railroad, of using the railroad, moving several locations for a single action, plus the new action of adding purifying water. And again, and then now the limited effect of researching a disease as opposed to curing a disease in traditional pandemic. This is a general overview of how pandemic Iberia plays. Yes, I needed this game. I didn't know it until I had it, which was great, but now I know that I need it. Because this is a great pandemic. This may be sorry for the heresy, this may be my favorite Pandemic. I think it's better than Pandemic Cthulhu. Although I am a big fan of Lovecraftian games, I'm not worn out by the fact that there are 12 new Lovecraftian games coming out every day. Bring more. That's not the problem there. Actually, I say there's no problem in Pandemic Cthulhu. It's a great game. And I don't have any problem with regular Pandemic, which is great. This game is greater. This game is better. The gameplay to me was like, I was blown away because I already like traditional Pandemic and the Cthulhu version, and also even other versions with expansions. But this is the best. This is amazing because I have all of the things that I like about Pandemic with a map that maybe it's the novelty, feels so fresh and feels so different. But I think I will like playing on this map for longer, for quite a while. I don't think it's just a novelty factor. I don't think it'll wear out anytime soon because it is such an interesting map with a lot more flexibility. Because if you're in Madrid, well, there are a lot of different places where you can go. You're not gonna move through a certain disease forever before you get to the next disease, etc., etc., etc. Simply the configuration, the square configuration in which everything is closer to each other, gives you more flexibility about changing plans and changing direction throughout gameplay. That is also enhanced by the possibility of building railways, but at the same time, that doesn't make the game easy because you have other elements that counterbalance that. So I love the flexibility that you have, the ability of reacting to things, but also, again, by changing your strategy as you go, by being able to move to one place to the other a little more easily, but at the same time, you also still have a lot of challenges, mainly from the fact that the diseases keep hitting and hitting and hitting. There's also another variant that is included here, sort of like a micro expansion in which the diseases will be even nastier than they are in the regular version of Pandemic Iberia. Also, they will behave differently. That adds a little bit of complexity, so the malaria works differently from yellow fever, but it adds more flavor, more thematic realism, while also increasing the difficulty of the game without increasing much of the complexity of gameplay. So you have a map that allows you for more flexibility, you have a system that allows you for more planning. I just felt much more engaged with the system. Regular Pandemic, again, I cannot stress this enough. Regular Pandemic is great. Cthulhu Pandemic is great. This one has all of the things I like in Pandemic with a map that is more engaging, gives you more tactical options and more strategic depth because you have, again, this balance between immediate reactions to what's happening on the board and medium and long-term planning. The new characters are fun. The Purify Water ability at the beginning, I thought, but this is overpowerful. This is gonna be so easy. But then, of course, you drop Purified Water in an area precisely because you need to go to do something else somewhere else. And then by the time the Purified Water is exhausted, you are in a place where, again, it's not impossible for you to go back, but you have to work about it. So the Purified Water was a nice balancing element compared to the difficulty of the fact that the diseases are restless or are merciless. So they are a nice counterbalancing element there, and at the end, when you compare the two things, you have an added resource and another challenge, and they work very well. It gave me a sort of Pandemic-like feel. I mean, I felt that I was playing Pandemic, but in a new way that felt very refreshing, very engaging, and just drew me in more powerfully than, I believe, even the original Pandemic. Again, I had to compare my early experiences with Pandemic with my early experience with Pandemic Iberia, because of course now I play Pandemic so many times. I wouldn't say that I enjoyed less. You enjoy it differently without those moments like whoa, without that awe, without that surprise, that sense of wonder that you have at the beginning. I still have this one for Pandemic Iberia, and again, I have the sense that sense of wonder will be here for longer than it even was for the original Pandemic, which is a game that I love. Pandemic Iberia has more interesting gameplay, a more challenging situation that presents you with different sets of resources. If you are growing tired of the original Pandemic, give this one a try. You will rekindle your love for the system. Even if you've never played Pandemic, and I don't know, well, maybe you have been living like in a patch of tall grass for the last 15 years, like a Pokemon or something, but I don't know how you would not have played Pandemic, and that's okay. I'm not blaming you, but it's just such a common game. If you have never played Pandemic and this is the game you want to play to get to know the system, this will be an excellent starting point because it's not more difficult to learn than the original Pandemic. You have one or two new rules, but then also you have drops a couple of other rules from the original game. Is the learning curve is exactly the same, which is actually not much of a curve at all, just a gentle slope, but gameplay is so much more interesting. Gameplay offers many more opportunities. Again, I don't find that, like in Pandemic, sometimes I get stuck in Bogota or I get stuck in some of these places in the middle of nowhere. Here you do not have that impression, as the map again is better interconnected with other challenges that make that tighter network connections not any easier to deal with. They don't make the game easier to win because moving around is a little easier and getting stuck somewhere is less likely. It's a great game. It's absolutely a great game. I cannot recommend it enough to anybody who wants to try the Pandemic system if they're new to it, or to anybody who has every other Pandemic and they think, okay, I don't need that extra one. Oh, you do. You do. Actually, maybe you don't need some of the older expansions anymore, but this one is different. This one brings the experience of playing Pandemic, in my opinion, to a whole different level. Just it improves upon it. It offers very strong, very engaging gameplay. All the things that you loved in Pandemic, but better, which is quite impressive achievement in my opinion.